I'm
Good.
delighted to, as chairman of the Black Country Society, to welcome all of you to this virtual heritage session. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Phillip to talk about John Louis Petit, who was an absolutely splendid artist. I've been able to purchase Philip's book on this subject, and I know that other individuals have recognized the importance of Petit's contribution as an artist and a charter of the local environment of the Black Country, but also Staffordshire and further afield. So, Phillip, I'm very happy to pass the floor over to you and to listen to your presentation tonight.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Just a couple of things really before we start with the main presentation. We've got lots of new people joining us tonight. So just to introduce ourselves very quickly, we've got Chris Baker, Ward Jones, and myself, Andrew Homer. We take it in turns to chair, and we've also got George McFadden on all things technical. Now, just the talks themselves are recorded and available on YouTube, but even so, if I could please ask you to keep microphones turned off unless you're actually speaking. Also, if you could turn video off during the talk, that helps a great deal with our bandwidth. Thank you very much, Malcolm, for that introduction. As usual with our meetings, questions are welcomed, but please put them in the Zoom chat as we go along, and Ward Jones will be curating them this evening. And as usual, we'll have a 10-minute chat room set up at the end. You're very welcome to join, of course, but they're not in any way compulsory. So if you want to leave at that point, of course, you're more than welcome. But we found that having the 10-minute chat at the end has been rather nice for members. So our talk tonight is on John Louis Petit. It's a name I know from spending much of my life in Sedgley, but I have to say not someone I know very much about. Now, our own Chris Baker will start by introducing his own research into Petit before our guest speaker, Phillip Modiano, will speak about his campaign to get Petit the recognition he deserves. Now, just by way of introductions, Chris Baker was born and brought up in Pensnet and attended Bromley Primary School and Briley Hill Grammar School. He spent his career up to his retirement in 2017 working for British Rail and the universities of Nottingham and Birmingham, working in the fields of civil and railway engineering. He's also an Anglican clergyman. He currently lives in Lichfield and is acting as the Society's webmaster and social media manager. Our guest this evening, Phillip Modiano, FSA, is an independent art historian working on John Louis Petit, artist and architectural writer. Petit had the opposition to Gothic and painted in a very unique style. However, after his death, his art was lost for 120 years. Phillip is the author of J.L. Petit's Britain's Lost Pre-Impressionists of 2022 and Petit's Tours of Old Staffordshire 2019, which was longlisted for the Berger Art Book Prize, and many academic and non-academic articles. He's currently working on an edited selection of Petit's writings. Besides research, Phillip gives lectures widely, including the Courtauld Institute of Art and Society of Antiquaries. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Chris Baker.
Thank you, Andrew. I will share screen. Hopefully it will all work. Andrew, can you just confirm that you can see that okay?
Yes, that's fine, Chris.
As Andrew said, this talk tonight is by myself and Phillip Modiano. What that really means is I will talk about 5 or 10 minutes and then Phillip will talk for much longer. It's really Phillip's talk. I'm just going to give a bit of Black Country context, I think is possibly the best way of describing it. I'll talk about 5 generations of the Petit family and talk about the specific Black Country paintings, and then Phillip will go on to talk about Petit himself and his art, and it will become very apparent that I am in no way qualified to talk about Petit's art. Phillip most certainly is, so you'll get more sense out of him in that regard. Sorry, my screen is doing funny things at this end. Excuse me while I get back to normal size. I want to start off by just thinking about the Petit family. And they're quite an interesting family, really. It all began, or as far as we know, with Louis Petit des Essarts in France. After the revocation of something called the Edict of Nantes, Louis and all his Huguenot friends faced severe persecution, and he basically fled, I'm told by Phillip, to take service with William of Orange, and came across to Britain with him. He fled France in 1685. He was an engineer in the British Army, and he rose to great heights at the Battle of Cadiz. He became governor of Minorca, and he was involved in putting down the Jacobite rebellion. So he certainly made his name. He came across to Britain, and those of you who know Black Country history will know that the Petits were far from the only Huguenots to come across an impact on the Black Country. We also have the glass-making Huguenot families of the Henses, the Tysacks, and so on, who many of you will know a lot more about than I do. The Petits influenced the Black Country in a very different way. Louis Petit des Essarts had 2 children. One of them, the elder Peter Petit, married a girl called Sarah Hayes. She was the daughter of John Hayes. And if I show a map now, that's just a map showing Wolverhampton there. And John Hayes owned the Ettingshall estate, a large agricultural estate to the south, and he also owned property in Little Aston and at Shares Hill as well. When John Hayes the elder died, it went nominally to his son, who also died, and not quite straightforward, but eventually the property came into the ownership of John Peter Petit. And we'll see it's the fortunes and the wealth of the Petits really flowed from the Ettingshall estate in particular, which was rich in coal. John Peter Petit had John Louis Petit, and he married again Catherine, and he was born at Little Aston near Lichfield. He went to Queen's Cambridge, a fellow of the Royal Society, a physician at St Bartholomew Hospital, a very able man. I think that's what comes across when you look at the Petits. They are generation upon generation of very talented people. And he wrote, interestingly, at the end of his life in his will, "I desire that my body may be opened for medical science, if the distemper of which I may die shall not have rendered it so loathsome as to endanger the operator, and that the sum of 10 guineas shall be given to the person who shall perform the operation," which was, of course, done in public. Moving on, John Louis Petit had 3 children. The middle one of those, Peter Hayes Petit, died was severely wounded at the Battle of Flushing in 1809. His brother, Louis Hayes Petit, was again a very talented individual, a barrister. He had property in Merridale on the west of Wolverhampton. He had mines in Bilston. He had a house in Lichfield, a huge house and property in Lichfield that stretched most of the length of the city. He was MP for Ripon and fellow of various royal societies. there's a monument to him in St Michael's Church in Lichfield, where I was a minister for 25 years. So I spent a good part of that 25 years looking at him at the front of the church. The other of John Louis's sons was John Hayes Petit, and he married Harriet Astley. John Hayes was born in Bloomsbury. He too went to Queen's. Harriet was one of the three daughters of John Astley, and who was known as the artist and lady killer, and Penelope Dunkfield Daniel, who inherited large estates in Cheshire, and later he married Mary Wagstaff, a wealthy surgeon. So that marriage, they're very good at marriages, the Petits. That marriage brought in a lot of artistic talent into a very talented family, and really quite a lot more money. There he's a curate at Shares Hill. They leased Coton Hall. Coton Hall was a huge estate. It was where, for the Black Country folk will know, it was where James Foster of the Ironmaster actually ended up. That's where you went when you were rich and famous. And Harriet and John then had a whole range of different children, including John Louis, whom we're going to be talking about today. And they had to broaden their vocabulary of children's names away from John, Louis, Peter and Hayes to encompass rather more of them. John Louis Petit at Trinity College, Cambridge. He was a curate at St Michael's Church for a while, curate in Mistley. He married Louisa Reed. They had no children, and he spent most of his life practicing his art and other lands in Middlesex and Herefordshire. So there are 5 generations of them, an extremely talented family. That's, I guess, the major point. And they added to that talent some very advantageous marriages. The Petit estate in 1840, if we show the red there, you can see where they had lands. They had land in Ettingshall, Bilston, Wolverhampton to the north of it. And when you add up Louis Hayes and John Louis's lands, and they all came to John Louis in the end, you've got 1,500 acres. That is a huge area. It's the equivalent of a medieval manor or two, particularly those properties in Ettingshall and Bilston were built on coal and iron. And again, they're the foundation of the Black Country, of course. The Ettingshall Park estate in the 1840s, it's actually shown on an 1880s map, but there you can see the red is John Louis Petit's land, the green at the bottom is Louis Hayes, black triangles are mines, red triangles, ironstone pits, green triangles, lime works, purple squares right at the top, ironworks, foundries, and so on. Again, Black Country folk will know that at the bottom there, in Louis Hayes's ground, we have Sedgley Beacon. Something of a folly. Whether Louis Hayes was instrumental in putting it up or not, I don't know. There might be people online who do. But a huge estate that was to yield much coal and iron, and that whole area now, of course, you'll know is absolutely unrecognisable. It is basically the outskirts of Wolverhampton. The family grave there is in St Michael's Churchyard in Lichfield. Do go and have a look. And it's got its own display board, thanks to Phillip. And there you'll see the inscription, and John Louis' inscription is in Latin there. But I just want to mention the Black Country paintings before I stop and hand over to Phillip. These aren't, well, I guess these are sort of Black Country paintings. Petit painted a lot from the area he knew. If you like, he painted the places he was associated with. He painted St Peter's, Wolverhampton many, many times. He painted Lichfield many times. But he also painted some Black Country scenes, very early industrial scenes in the Black Country. And Phillip will talk about these in artistic terms. All I would say now is I think in historical terms, these pictures are really quite significant. They're very early representations of industrial processes. Mine's near Wolverhampton there, showing the two-pit rattle chain system. I'm told by someone who's been in contact with me that Millfield Works in Bilston must be pre-1839, because at that stage it went down to 3 furnaces. Again, if anyone wants to, and I'm conscious there are people online already, I know you're there, who know far more about Black Country Ironworks than I do, and you might care to share some of your views on these pictures. But again, place. He knew Bilston, he had estates in Bilston. That long distance shot of a foundry again, I think that's possibly from the western side of the Ettingshall estate, somewhere near the headwaters of the Pembroke that flows into the Smestow, perhaps conjectural. Springvale Ironworks at Bilston, 1852, again from the Ettingshall estate. I can't comment on them artistically, but as I say, these show very early, quite historically important scenes in the Black Country. And at that point, you've heard enough of me. I've tried to give a context of Petit, his family, how he was located, how he relates to the Black Country. I'm going to stop sharing there and let Phillip take over. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you also, Malcolm, for your kind words at the outset. Now, can everybody see the first slide?
I can see that, yes.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Let me just get rid of all of those thumbnails. Good. Well, that's a perfect introduction to Petit's family and the context. The thing that's probably most remarkable is that Petit was nationally famous in his day, both for art and as the leading opponent to the Gothic Revival. But sadly, he's been almost entirely forgotten in both. Now, if I can get my slides do not move, and I do not know why. What happens if I try that one? Okay, there's one way of doing it which works, so I'll have to do that. Apologies for that. So what I'm going to do today is explain why he is potentially such an important person, even though he's been forgotten for 150 some years. And that'll look at his key achievements in both architecture and art, but mainly art. Then we'll get into the artistic significance of the Black Country pictures that Chris has just shown you. But lastly, and most importantly, from my point of view, I believe that there is an opportunity for Wolverhampton to promote itself through its heritage. It has always failed to do that, and I think the advent of Petit and others gives it an opportunity which should not be missed. And I'm actually here to ask for your help in that too. So for me, that last bit is the most important of all. But let's start by what he achieved. And I'll say a few words on architecture before we get into art. He hits the public stage in 1841, so aged 40, with his first book, Remarks on Church Architecture. He retired, if you remember, Chris mentioned it, working full-time as a curate in 1834. So he spent 7 years preparing it. With 300 illustrations from his own watercolors, as you see here, it was considered by many to be the greatest work on architecture by a living author until that time. But also it was heavily criticized by the Gothicists. So that got him into right in the center of the debate about architecture. And he stayed at the center of the debate pretty much until the middle 60s. So he somewhat declined in his last decade. He was one of the most prolific writers and most popular lecturers because he brought his art to the lectures. So imagine that between us, me and Chris are showing you about 100 slides. Petit would have 100 pictures pinned to the walls in his lecture room. The most important, of course, were in London. Sorry, I was getting a bit of feedback there. I was wondering if someone was trying to tell me something. But also at Reba and the regional societies. There was one other major book called Architectural Studies in France, which came out in 1854. And here he drew attention to the complexity, variety, and harmony of French Romanesque. It became known as the Angevin style, round arches, apses, and domes. And this widened the high Victorian repertoire and helped bring the Gothic revival to a slightly more varied stage, even though he was still opposing it at the same time. For 27 years, in fact, he was consistent. 3 points he hammered away at all the time. First of all, that Victorian Gothic was inauthentic and doomed to fail as out of place in modern Victorian society. Ours is not the age of Gothic art, he would write, but only of imitation. And the highest praise is that a thing may be taken for something it is not. Petit loved the genuine Gothic, but hated the imitation. The second point, he found beauty and something to be learnt from all his historical styles. So rules in architecture, or one correct style for architects, he felt was absurd. Ironically, Ruskin arrives at something similar in Modern Painters in 1856, after his main publications in architecture, where he says, "The moment any man begins to talk about rules in whatsoever art, you may know him for a second-rate man, and to this rule there's no exception in any art." It's a bit ironic because, in fact, in The Stones of Venice, he was strongly recommending Venetian Gothic. Petit's third point is that architects should be original while building on all past traditions and using the past freely. Now, that sounds like common sense, you might think, but it was not so then, nor indeed in much of the 20th century either. When there was a huge fashion, of course, for tabula rasa modernism, i.e. throwing away the past. Petit would write, "Let us aim to go beyond our predecessors. Let us aim at some standard of perfection above any which they reached. I may be describing an impossibility, but if we try to reach it, we shall be sure to do something." He was not an architect. He built only 2 buildings directly, one a completed church in Wales, now recently upgraded to grade 1. It still stands just outside Barmouth. Grade 1 because of its originality and harmony with the landscape, as you see in Petit's pictures here. The other was his summer house in Staffordshire. Sadly, it's no longer with us. But in fact, he was much more influential than he's been given credit for reasons we could talk about later. In particular, he provided the intellectual cover, if you like, for most of the non-Gothic architecture, and it's quite a lot that was built during that period. But just to continue with one more point on this, and perhaps the most relevant one to modern times, it's also the subject of my current research, is that he stands at the head of a thin but an important tradition in architectural thinking that argues against the architectural fashion of the day, be it Gothic in his time or international modernism in the recent past. This line includes people like Sir Ninian Comper, Sir Reginald Blomfield, Stephen Dykes Bower, and even, a little ironically, Giles Gilbert Scott, the son of Petit's great opponent, Sir George Gilbert Scott. All of those people that he foreshadows all face vitriolic criticism from the fashionistas of the day, and all have been downgraded in architectural history, especially during the late 20th century, i.e. just in our lifetimes. We don't have any more time for architecture because the story in art is bigger and there's a more direct legacy of his work, and because of its direct relevance to yourselves. Petit was a prolific artist, mainly of architectural studies, well, half that is, the top right picture, and landscapes, often with a building somewhere in the distance. There are no portraits except a few of the family pets from right at the end of his life. By location, Britain and France predominate. He travelled in both practically each year from 1854. He also visited the Low Countries, Germany, Italy, and Ireland more than once each, and Spain, Greece, the Middle East, and Constantinople once. He was quite relentless, covering at least 80,000 miles in his lifetime, initially by horse and boat, later, of course, with help from trains. In this country, he's a significant artist of several counties. By that I mean leaving one of the most important legacies of work of those parts. And I'd especially note Staffordshire, his home county, South Derbyshire, the Black Country, and East Shropshire. Yorkshire, Kent, and Sussex, of course, have got many other painters, so there's some competition. Whereas in that first list, he's practically, in fact, I would say definitely head and shoulders above all the others, except the Black Country, perhaps, where there's also one very important painter, Butler Bayliss, who we'll talk about later. And he also has interesting coverage of quite a number of other counties too. But being a topographical artist is not why Petit should be considered a great artist. It's something of which there were many, and particularly of watercolors. There are three particular reasons why he should be considered a great artist. The first is that he was painting way ahead of his time, what I call Britain's lost pre-impressionist, as this comparison with a Pissarro picture, which I'll talk about a bit later, I think brings out most clearly. It's one of several comparisons that I'll explain. The second reason is that he is the most remarkable artist of churches right across Europe, from Scotland to Constantinople, but medieval churches only, nothing that was built after 1700. And the third reason, and the one that you're most interested in, I presume, is because of his unique art of what one could say is the reality of Victorian life, which almost no other painters during his lifetime painted. This is where the Black Country pictures fit in, but not just from the Black Country. There I'm showing you on the left a unique picture of the Lowmore Works just outside Bradford. But first, let me answer the question as to how come no one has heard of him. The key thing is that he exhibited his art widely, but never tried to sell it. He kept it all for his own use, and he never wanted to sell things. It was almost beneath his position to try to sell any. So he gave some away when he was asked. And on his sudden death, it passed to his sisters and then a nephew, with the exception of about 900 pictures, which went to other members of the family. But then it disappeared. The lady that you see there in the picture is Elsie Tate, the only daughter of the nephew who ended up taking Petit's pictures. She died in that large house in Surrey that you see there in 1957. Her children inventoried the contents, sold the house, and moved out. The entire hoard of Petit pictures and his papers were abandoned in an outhouse and were entirely missed. The new owners a wealthy childless couple from the Channel Islands called Dennis and Marjorie Alderson were probably the worst inheritors of a hoard of pictures one could wish for. By accounts that I've pretty much verified, they were asset strippers, as was apparently not uncommon in the 50s and 60s. They stripped and sold off the wood panelling, the fireplaces, the staircases, anything that they could. The watercolours they dumped in local auctions, and the papers were 90% sure were burnt. There was a big bonfire of lots of important looking papers in the year 2000. The first sale of pictures I've recorded is 1979. They were then offloaded over the next 20 years with the help of a cooperative auctioneer at Billingshurst, who asked no questions. He appears on the Antique Roadshow. 6 dealers scooped them up and sent the pictures literally all around the world. I came across them in 2016 when I started the quest to rehabilitate Petit. Roughly 8,000 pictures, or about half of what Petit painted, I think, were salvageable from the storage and were scattered in lots of about 15 to 250 pictures. The argument that I, and fortunately others now make, is that Petit is one of the great artists of the 19th century. But so that you don't think I'm a lone voice, I just want to give the floor for a second to 2 very prominent art experts. These are the art broadcaster Andrew Graham Dixon on the right and the editor of the British Art Journal, Robin Simon, on the left. There are others who are supporters, curators from the Tate and V&A, but Robin and Andrew not only wrote for my book, very good endorsements, they also made a short film, and I'll show you a couple of clips of that during this talk. Andrew wrote, "There's been nothing like this in the field of British art for a generation. It marks the discovery of a more or less completely forgotten master, an artist whose work reaches the highest peaks of innovation and virtuosity, worthy of comparison with that even of Turner, high praise, but not too high." And he continues, "Few Victorian artists chose to bear witness to the Industrial Revolution, but Petit did anything but shy away from it." It was this quote that actually helped the book get lots of national publicity last year and got Petit into quite a number of homes. But just as an aside, this Black Country picture emerged from the gloom just 6 months ago, an illustration of the fact there's so much more of Petit to discover. This was hiding in plain sight in the Bantock House Museum just to the north of Wolverhampton. A colleague recognized it as being by Petit, though it had no caption, no one knew what it was of, and no one knew who the artist was either. Now, it is in fact showing the old hall, which was being used as a japanning factory. And therefore, it's quite a significant picture to add to the 4 that Chris showed you. And here, though, is the short film, a clip of the short film with Andrew Graham Dixon introducing Robin Simon.
Partly for solidarity, just so that you know that Philip and I aren't just making all this up. I have with me here today an extremely distinguished editor of the British Art Journal, no less, Robin Simon, who is also a great enthusiast for Petit. So, Robin, please add your voice to the support.
Well, I certainly am an enthusiast for Petit. It's one of the most exciting things that's happened in a rather too long career. This wonderful rediscovery of a remarkable man. He's a fantastic artist. I'm going to start by saying that. He reminds you of so many people, and yet he never suffers in the comparison.
Sorry for cutting him off. We'll get another clip a bit later, but there's a lot we need to cover. One last aside before we get into some detail. Petit was widely regarded as a very good man. And here is what Sir George Gilbert Scott said about him 10 years after his death. Remember, of course, that Scott was Petit's architectural opponent throughout his career. Scott wrote, "I really had a sincere affection and an immense admiration for him. He was of a noble, generous nature, both as a scholar, as a gentleman, and as a most original artist, a grand creature, as noble-hearted a man as ever lived. And if your enemies say that about you after you die, you must be doing something right." Now let's get into the art in a fraction more detail before we get back to the Black Country, the other two items that I talked about. And you need a bit of context for those of you who are not familiar with art in the mid-19th century. Both in Britain and France, there was a rebellion by artists against the classical style. We in this country, shown on the left, took a historical turn, like Gothic architecture, with the Pre-Raphaelites, while in France, Impressionism would emerge about 20 years later. Now, Petit has got absolutely nothing in common with the Pre-Raphaelites, as these two Welsh landscapes show you. They're both Welsh footpaths, wholly different in about every single way. Above, by Thomas Seddon, is a picture now in the Tate, and it shows why Ruskin despaired of the Pre-Raphaelite landscape work, writing in the 4th volume of Modern Painters that they were destitute of the power of feeling vastness, their fancies caught by a piece of hedge or duck pond. Now, in fact, we can admire it as a very pretty picture, but it does show that absence of vastness and a focus on a mythical, idealized presentation of nature and of farming, whereas Petit, for all of its crudeness and directness, which is quite done very much deliberately, he presents the rugged beauty of the Welsh hills. And it's in that clear intention to present vastness with an immediacy that he's moving in a completely different direction to the PRB, and uniquely in Britain after the death of Turner in 1852. He's got much more in common with the Impressionists in France 20 years later. This is the comparison I showed you earlier. They're both town scenes. The Pissarro on the right is done with a sprinkling of snow, whereas Petit's is in rain. The difference is that Petit is showing the impact and the dominance of the church on the town, whereas Pissarro is focusing on the simple street scene. Because of its being a rare Impressionist picture with limited colour, I could match a dozen Petits to it. Here's another example with a Monet, also exactly 18 years later. The composition, subjects and technique are identical, except that Monet enriches his picture with more colour. For example, the horizon, which he sets with a bright green line that you see there, Petit picks it out with other boats. The richer, varied and soothing colours in the Monet make it far better to hang on a wall. And it's more commercial if you get a choice of which to own, choose the Monet. But Petit's colours might better reflect the harshness and monotony of a fisherman's trade. Another example, Impressionists are known to be the first to paint everyday snow scenes to capture the light effects, starting around the 1870s with that Pissarro in Upper Norwood in England when he was fleeing the fighting in France. And certainly not in the Midlands of England, but Petit's picture on the left from 1855 is just outside Lichfield in one of the coldest winters on record. And to make the modern point finally in a different way, here we've got 3 pictures of the Roman Forum by Samuel Palmer, top right, a classical picture, Petit on the left and John Piper, bottom right. The Palmer and the Petit are both from the 1850s, the Piper from the 1960s, but artistically I think you can immediately see that the Petit is halfway between the other two. The other reason that I wanted to mention why Petit is a great artist is because of the sheer scale and his achievement in painting medieval churches right across Europe, about half his output, mainly to support his architectural lectures and books. And they differ from typical representations of church, which was a very popular subject by many artists, because of how he captures character. And one of the best examples is this picture of St. Peter's, which Chris showed you earlier. It captures the pride and the independence of the church before it was taken over by the diocese at the end of the 1840s. It was already being talked about at this stage, and before it was renovated by Sir George Gilbert Scott in the 1850s. So those two reasons, with an emphasis, I think, on the first, are important. But now let's come on to this third aspect, probably for our purposes the most important, the gritty reality of Victorian life. There are about 60 such pictures, of which the most important are the Black Country landscapes and furnaces that Chris has already introduced. The thing about the two landscapes is that they work brilliantly as showing both the ugly consequences of the industrial development, but yet at the same time showing a strange beauty in that ugliness, which many people from Wolverhampton and the Black Country have told me about, and I've seen. This one with the stunted trees and stagnant pools, and this one with the churches vying for the skyline with the mine shafts. They're beautiful pictures, but they are truthful, and they don't hide anything of the reality of what was going on. These are from the 1830s. Petit, by the way, his record throughout was always to paint accurately. He would choose his view very carefully, but then he would stick to what is authentic. Now, artistically, the two furnaces are actually even more interesting than the two landscapes. Again, this dates from the 1830s, as we've seen. As a work of art, it's extraordinary. It's a little bit tending towards the classic because it's a framed composition, but the dark monochrome color avoids any attempt at a pretty picture for a wall. And in particular, it's focusing on the furnace as a powerful work of architecture, while in no way denying the blackness of its effects on the landscape. And if that's not enough, Petit returns in 1852 to do this picture. And this is shown with all of the edges. So you see how it barely survived storage. It was in the bottom of a pile of pictures that I found in a dealer's cellar. What's particularly special about this is the immediacy of it. So Petit is not painting a picture in a frame at all, but this is the first stage towards an impressionist picture. But again, avoiding anything that might be considered pretty, including so much else within the picture, the cottages huddled under the lee of the furnace, the horses plodding along solidly. This was exhibited in 1856 at one of Petit's lectures, and again where he wanted to talk about the architectural power of the furnaces near Wolverhampton, showing more vigorous architecture than all the copy Gothic churches of the revivalists, which wound them up as it was intended to, and led to a very interesting correspondence in one of the local magazines. But let me play you a snippet of this picture by Andrew Graham Dixon.
Here even, I think, one of my favourite images of all of Petit's work, because how many Victorian artists dared to actually confront and look at and depict the Industrial Revolution, the smoke, the smog, the factories. And this is just fantastic. This is a sort of 19th century glimpse of, I can almost hear the Coronation Street music playing as I look at this, except, of course, it's not romanticized, idealized.
That point that Andrew makes is very important, that it's not romanticized or idealized as much of art up to that time was. And indeed, for me, for Andrew and for Robin, this is potentially one of the great works of art of the 19th century in Britain. Now, that's a huge claim, but it's easily defensible. What other picture can show the emergence of the Industrial Revolution? Well, I'm going to show you some examples so you can make your own minds up. But if I was a Japanese or German tourist visiting the Telford Bridge and looking for the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, frankly, I would be disappointed. But if I went to Wolverhampton Gallery and saw this, then I think I would feel that I found something worth the journey. There are many other pictures, as I said, 60 that Petit painted that I've found so far. And since I've probably found about a third of what survived, there are possibly 100 more to be found. This is the slate pits in Leicestershire and the Great Pit, which was 50 meters deep. It's the only known picture of that scene. This is the shot tower near Waterloo Bridge with St. Paul's in the mist in the background, a deliberate contrast. This is not a unique picture of the shot tower. There's one other known of that. But this is one of my favorite, prison hulks off Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey, the only known picture of prison hulks and the only known artistic reference. This from the 1830s until Dickens writes a sentence or two in Great Expectations in the 1860s. Prison hulks were literal death traps. The prisoners who died, 25%, were loosely buried on the beach and still occasionally dug up now. Sheerness still hosts 3 prisons. This is not typical artist by any means, but the important thing from an artistic point of view is how he managed to capture the horror and the evilness by placing those 3 jet black hulks right across the center of the picture. The story of this was actually very popular on Instagram when a colleague posted it. So how rare are these pictures? The Tate mounted an exhibition in London last year called Turner's Modern World, which attempted to cover the same topic. They found 1 or 2 lovely Turner pictures, such as the Foundry I showed there on the left. Then they added some marine pictures included because they show a steamship. Then they went to other artists and they found 1 picture of furnaces, this from the 18th century by Paul Sanby Bunn. And altogether, those that were loosely related came to a total of 40 pictures. They then added 100 pictures, other Turner pictures with some vague connection to modern life in order to make up the exhibition. One example was this, your beautiful Turner of the annual fair in Wolverhampton. I don't criticize it in the slightest as a picture, but it's not painting the same theme that both the exhibition advertised and that I'm trying to show you that Petit's pictures are a huge addition to. And just as an aside, Petit paints the same square nearly 50 years later. Not nearly as much movement and activity to make such a beautiful picture as the Turner, but he focuses, if you look, at the gas lamp right in the center beneath the tower of St. Peter's and the scaffolding on the top of St. Peter's. And is this not, I think, a hint at what the square was actually used for quite a lot more times than it was an annual fair, but for executions. And let me also show you this picture, which was also included, a classical picture by Andrew Wilde, done for Queen Victoria in the Royal Collection, showing the distant furnaces outside Manchester. And as the caption says, this is from the caption in the collection, rustics and goats in the foreground and the setting sun provide a romantic setting for the chimneys. And to compare the two, the classic picture versus what Petit achieved, bear in mind these were the same year. I think if you put them side by side, it's fairly obvious. The Wilde is a distortion of reality for Queen Victoria, a public relations spin. The point, though, is that Petit's pictures are not 100% unique, but they're a huge addition in both quality and quantity on what was available until then, and until the emergence of Butler Baynes at the turn of the 20th century. Quite remarkably, Butler Baylis is like Petit from a wealthy family and free to paint what he saw, as opposed to painting for commission or to sell. He also paints in the free impressionistic style. And he has also been ignored or downplayed for most of the time afterwards. His work occasionally does get brought out by Wolverhampton Art Gallery, and very recently too. But overall, it has been not exhibited, and Butler Baylis also does not have the reputation that I think he deserves. So what might all this mean for Wolverhampton? And this is really the subject that I want to raise with you. So far, the city has never advertised its heritage. With Petit, this disregard is only made worse. Great heritage promotes pride for the inhabitants as well as attracting outsiders. And surely it's time to reconsider. Let me pass over, because of time, a bit about the Petit Society. We can come back to that if you want. I just want to focus on the council and where I've got to. I've met with the council communications director and a senior curator at the gallery, and they both promised to consider emphasizing heritage in general, and Petit and Butler Baylis in particular. For the gallery, it's easy, and they have said that they will redesign some of their galleries to make a permanent exhibition of Butler Baylis, and I hope they will include Petit within that. But it's not just that. There's the architecture in the centre, the church. The old hall is now pulled down, but that would be a lovely walk to the old hall through the brutalist architecture of the town centre and back again. And then you've got all of the other old buildings too. And if you go on the gallery website, the only branding that you see is Pop Art City. And I can assure you, in the art world, there is no worse possible branding than Pop Art City, which is referring to a movement 50 years ago that it's still, there are still some very important artists in New York and London, but nobody will visit Wolverhampton in order to look at pop art, and it won't do anything for the inhabitants either. So this picture in particular, I think, constitutes something which is international class. I think several of Butler Baylis I put in that category too, and Petit and Butler Baylis is surely all that any gallery could possibly wish for. So my request to you all is please, to the society, I should say, not as in individuals, but to the society, to write a letter to the leader of the Councillor Simpkins, asking for a new emphasis on heritage in how the city promotes itself. I suggest the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. But certainly there is no good branding or publicity or PR work either on the website that I've seen. The reasons are the two that I mentioned, and this should affect council literature and branding. And of course, the art gallery. That is ultimately my most important priority. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. I really do appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you all.
Thank you, Philip. Before handing over to Ward Jones for any questions, I really would just like to say a massive thank you to both Chris and, of course, yourself, Philip, for a fascinating talk this evening on someone who clearly deserves much more exposure than he's currently getting. Now, please do put any questions or comments in the chat. And I'm going to hand over now to Ward Jones, who will curate any questions or comments that you have.
Thank you, Andrew.
Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, you're the only person with a question at the moment, and it really goes back to Chris's introduction. And it's that old chestnut of Sedgley Beacon. And
yeah.
Was it built by Petit? Did he build it on behalf of somebody else, or what? Any thoughts? Philip, I'll welcome your views on it if you've got any views.
Yes, I did have a long correspondence with a lady who was a very avid researcher on this topic, but she was never able to show me any direct proof. It's certainly not in a style that I would think that Petit would have any particular argument to say that it's his. I understood from her research that the estate was at that time let out. It wasn't under the direct control of either of the Petits. So it would clearly have to have been the responsibility of the tenant, I thought. But none of that is a very strong view, and I don't have any evidence that I could bring out other than the emails and records that this lady pointed me to.
Thank you. I wonder if anybody who's listening in has any views on this or any information that they think is supporting Petit or against Petit.
I mean, in terms of Sedgley Beacon, all I would say is that Sedgley Beacon was built at a time when Louis Hayes Petit owned the land. And who by or how, I have no idea. But it's there in black and white on the tithe map. So, you know, it certainly owned that bit of land where it was built.
Petit Society says, thank you so much, Philip and Chris. Such an interesting talk and learnt so much. Surprised that Petit has such a little profile, really. Well, we're hearing on to your views about how we might promote Petit.
Yes, I tried to explain why that is, both in terms of art and of architecture. I think that it's impossible for people here to shout about Petit as a significant artist. I have to do that in London, but what you can shout about is the incredible art of the Industrial Revolution that Petit and Butler Baylis have made, and which so far has been, well, Butler Baylis has been exhibited occasionally, but not with the attention drawing gravitas that it together with Petit deserve.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Jonathan in Blackheath says, is there any prospect of a Petit exhibition anytime soon? I would love to see one, wouldn't we all?
Yes, there is. So far, Staffordshire Staffordshire County has planned a multi-site exhibition starting in late 2025, when the new art centre in Stafford is completed. So Ashbourne in South Derbyshire has asked to participate. Lichfield, of course, will participate, and I hope one or two other sites that they control. That doesn't help with the Wolverhampton and the Black Country pictures. The art gallery has made positive noises for 5 years. They are apparently redesigning some of their exhibition space. So whatever support and pressure could be put on the art gallery, I think it's quite timely, because they recognize the well, they say to me that they recognize the significance of the art. I could tell you lots of stories about my dealings with them.
Lynn and Julian Hinton ask, where can we see some of Petit's paintings today, presumably? Are there
on the website? On the website, www.revpetit.com, there's a little online exhibition of 50 pictures. In each of the books that Malcolm mentioned, there are 100+ pictures. There are none on public display, except for 5 in the Samuel Johnson Birthplace Museum, but those are all very early ones, and I don't think that they're not explained or anything like that. They're literally put up just to fill wall space. So I'm afraid it's indirectly to begin with, and then directly, hopefully starting 2025.
Very good. Now, I'm just wondering whether Fiona has a painting that she thinks might be a Petit painting, because she asks, are there key elements in Petit's painting style that would identify him as the artist in an unsigned picture?
Yes, all Petit's pictures are unsigned. If ever you see a Petit picture signed by Petit, and there were 2 on eBay a short while ago, those signatures have almost certainly been put on by dealers. The only issue about Petit pictures is that his sisters painted with him, initially badly, but later very well. And all of their pictures were initially sold by the dealers as Petits. So that's also a complicating factor that we've had to deal with. But if you do have a picture and you're unsure, there's an inquiries email address on the website, and I and one other colleague will jointly look at any picture and give you our view. And if you want a certificate, that we make a small charge for the second.
Yeah, fascinating that. Yeah. Anybody else got a question? I think I've gone through the list on the chat. No, in which case, shall we go to breakouts? Andrew, are you?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. It's George who's going to.
Yeah. So we're. Oh, sorry. I was just going to.
Yeah.
I was just going to make one comment, and then I see Chris wants a word. My comment was that slide towards the end where you were talking about promoting Petit and in association with Wolverhampton, and that those words, Wolverhampton as the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and my hackles pricked up at that point. But
I think there might be some argument there.
Chris, you were going to say?
Yeah, just something about the next meeting. Our very first meeting this session in September was changed at the last minute because Keith Robinson was poorly. Keith is now better, and he is going to be the speaker at the next meeting. So Keith will talk about the struggle of the 19th century miners for justice, and that will be advertised in the normal way. Thank you.